Thank you all for joining us on the latest in our data protection webinars. You all know we've been running these webinars for some time now on a regular basis. The three speakers today are me. I'm Tom Phipps. I'm a consultant with the firm. Charlotte Kingman is an associate with the firm, who many of you will know, and Hannah, a solicitor in the firm. And the three of us, plus a couple of others, comprise the Ashfords data protection and privacy team. Can I ask first, just to be very, very boring, that you all put your mics on mute so that we can minimize any feedback issues. As regards questions, please feel free to email any of us with any questions you might have following the webinar. And just to say also, the webinar is being recorded and will be put up on the website. So if any of you are desperate to see it again, feel free to do so. So today we're talking about AdTech. If we could move on to, perfect, thank you. So I'm going to deal with the first part, which is just to talk in general about what AdTech is, a little bit about real-time bidding, and the legal framework that's behind all that, and the what needs to be taken into account regarding AdTech. Hannah will then talk in more detail about cookies and the legal issues that arise from that, and Charlotte will conclude with more detail about real-time bidding. So moving on, where are other tools which are designed to target, deliver, and analyze advertising. So it's all about trying to make sure that advertising is targeted to the right people and delivered to them directly, and that the results of that advertising can also be analyzed as to its success or otherwise. Programmatic AdTech is AdTech which is aimed at target audiences, and omni-channel AdTech is where it's aimed at consumers across all channels, including mobile, desktop, video, or whatever it might be. Obviously, they're not mutually exclusive. Omni-channel AdTech can, and in fact, usually is also programmatic. I've noticed at home, for example, that AdTech seems to work now via a router. If somebody in my household does an internet search for something, then it'll end up appearing on, I'll get targeted advertising on my Facebook page, often in my experience for bras, in fact, but anyway, there we are. So moving on to the next slide. What's real-time bidding? Well, real-time bidding is the selling of advertising space which allows advertisers to target specific users based on their browsing history. So if you're able to find people to target your advertising based on what they've been doing on the internet, that's absolute gold dust to advertisers, an advertiser's dream, if you like. Real-time bidding depends on cookies. First-party cookies are the most obvious of those, and those are the cookies that are created when you visit a website. So that the website itself will put cookies on your machine. Third-party cookies are the much more subtle ones, and those are created by domains other than the one the user intends to visit. But what they do is build a picture of a user's browsing history in a much more sophisticated and more general way. So advertisers are very fond of using third-party cookies. Hannah and Charlotte are going to look at those in more detail later on. But what's the legal framework for all that? I mean, to work, AdTech has got to target effectively, and it's got to analyze what individuals do when they're online. Advertisers want access to information about what people look at, what they buy or choose not to buy, and their age, gender, affiliations, demographic material, as much information as they can get, to try to make the advertising spend as effective and productive as it possibly can be. So what does the law say about all that? Well, there are two There are two pieces of legislation that are relevant. The first and most obvious is UK GDPR. To go back to absolute basics, personal data is data from which an individual may be identified, whether in itself or in combination with other data. And very obviously, that is very relevant in the AdTech arena, because there is very likely to be personal data contained in the information that's being collected. Some of that data may also be special category data. And UK GDPR regards special category data as particularly sensitive. And from an advertiser's point of view, it includes very valuable things such as racial or ethnic origin, people's beliefs and affiliations, health information about individuals, maybe information about their sex life or sexual orientation. All that is really useful to advertisers, but is special category data from a data protection point of view. It follows that the collection and processing of that data has to be GDPR compliant. In general terms, that is going to require consent from the individuals about whom the data is being collected. And that's got to be opt-in consent, not just opt-out or inferred or implied consent. They've actually got to opt in. And in relation to special category data, that particularly sensitive material, it has to be explicit consent. Explicit consent isn't defined, but it's something more than just consent. And what the ICO says about it is that explicit consent must be a very clear statement. It must be consent to the particular type of special category data being collected, and it must be separate from any other consent that the individual has given. So you've got to go that step further to collect the special category data and process it. The other piece of legislation which is relevant is the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations 2003, a bit of a mouthful. I've set out the relevant provision in full on the slide, but essentially what that provision means is that if you want to put a cookie on somebody's computer, you've got to get consent. In very basic terms, that's what that says. What's the ICO thinking about all this at the moment? Well, on the 22nd of January, the ICO issued a statement saying that it was going to resume its AdTech investigation because it is very worried about AdTech. And I've put that extract from the statement on the slide. First part is really interesting. All organizations operating in the AdTech space should be assessing how they use personal data as a matter of urgency. So this is very much at the forefront of what the ICO is focusing on at the moment. So I'll now pass on to Hannah, who will go into more detail about first-party and third-party cookies.
Thank you, Tom. So when we talk about cookies, most people probably do have a good understanding that these are used by websites to save information about the person that's viewing that site and looking at how they're interacting with the site. A key distinction, though, as Tom's touched upon, is between first and third-party cookies. So when we look at first-party cookies, these are the cookies that will be set by the website that you're visiting. And examples of these can be both essential and non-essential cookies. So essential cookies, a good example being if you visit an e-commerce website and you add something to your shopping basket, a cookie is used so that that item is sort of remembered as being added to the basket when you then move to the next page. Clearly, that's essential to enable you to make a purchase via the website. In contrast, then, you've got non-essential cookies, and these are looking at primarily analysing a user's behaviour on the website. So often you'll see non-essential cookies are used to track which pages you visit or how long you stay on certain pages. If we then look at third parties in contrast, these are what they say they are. They're cookies that are set by a third party website, so a website other than the one that you're on. Because we're looking at AdTech today, it's going to be these third-party cookies that I'm really focusing on. And I want to delve a bit deeper into the data protection compliance concerns with third-party cookies specifically. Now, the third parties setting these cookies are the likes of big social media platforms, advertising firms, and what they do is they then track users across multiple sites. So they'll build a really full picture of your user behaviours. So they'll look at what purchases you've made, what websites you've visited more frequently than others. And once they've built this user profile and they've collected all this data about you, it's shared with all parties within that AdTech ecosystem. Charlotte's going to be exploring in a bit more detail exactly how that sharing happens. But for now, the key things to sort of bear in mind are that the reason this third-party data is collected and shared in this way is firstly to enable the delivery of targeted and focused advertising, so that you can really understand users' preferences and meet those, and also to engage with and look at the success of certain adverts. So I think the advantages of those third-party cookies are quite clear. For businesses, you can tap into much wider pools of data and really target your advertising strategy. You're going to have much more effective marketing if you can target it to a user's preferences. From a consumer perspective, I think there's also a lot of benefits because as a consumer, we want to see content that we're interested in. That's definitely a preference over content that we don't have any interest in. But that aside, we've got clear privacy concerns when we're doing this. So when you're tracking online behaviour, that is incredibly invasive, and there's compliance risks for every party in that chain. So what I want to do is start with a quick summary of the legal position, which Tom has already touched upon. So we've got the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations, and it's PECA is commonly abbreviated to, and Regulation 6 was the one that Tom included an extract to or for on his slide. This says that in order to store or gain access to information contained within a device, you need to do two things. You need to provide clear and comprehensive information, and you need to collect consent. There is an exemption, which is for those strictly necessary cookies that I mentioned earlier. So those that are really necessary to provide functionality that a user's requested. So the shopping basket example. But unless you can show that it's strictly necessary, you need to be meeting these requirements of providing clear and comprehensive information and collecting consent. So for third-party cookies, which are tracking user behaviour across multiple websites, building up this profile of a user, clearly that is not strictly necessary. And as a result, we are going to need to comply with these two items on the slide. So what does clear and comprehensive information look like, and what does consent look like? When we're interpreting these terms, we need to look to the applicable data protection legislation. And these in the UK are the UK GDPR and also the Data Protection Act 2018. So under the UK GDPR, we've got the transparency principle and also the right to be informed. So when we're looking at what information to share with a data subject about the cookies, we need to make sure that the information is consistent with that principle and that right. So we need to be really detailed in providing information on the specific cookies, why we're using those cookies, what third parties are going to have access to the information collected from those cookies, and also the duration that those cookies are going to be set for. And it's all well and good providing a long list of technical information, but the majority of consumers aren't going to be able to understand that. So we're really looking for user-friendly summaries that people can really engage with. If we then look to consent, again, it's the UK GDPR standard of consent that we need, so freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. We need to be giving the user enough information so they can make an informed decision about their use of that cookie. And then it's also, as Tom touched upon, not looking at pre-tick boxes. It needs to be an active opt-in consent. So often you'll see on cookie banners, it will say by continuing to use this website, you consent to use of cookies. That would not be sufficient. There's not an active, there's not an action by the individual to signify their consent. Another quick takeaway there as well is you can't incentivize someone to provide their consent, because if they're incentivized, obviously that consent is not freely given. A side note on the consent point is that this is really one to watch. So at a recent G7 Data Protection Authorities meeting, it was flagged as a key concern, and that's because we're all seeing these cookie consent pop-ups when we visit websites. But we're quite fatigued to them now. So that consent we're giving isn't meaningful. We often will just click I accept just to get that pop-up banner to disappear. We're not really engaging with the information. And I think it's definitely acknowledged that that's happening. And so Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner, she's called for international collaboration on this to try and find a solution. And I think what this solution looks like is a means of people setting their privacy preferences at sort of an overarching level. That then means that you aren't going to have to click cookie consent pop-up bars, click that you accept every single time you land on a website. So that's obviously going to be a much better, much more streamlined process for a user when you visit a website. For now, though, until we have a solution, it's important that you keep users informed about the cookies that you're using and you offer a genuine choice about those non-essential cookies. We then move on to the next slide. I want to delve into why compliance is particularly difficult when looking at third-party cookies. On the slide, I've included what I see are the 4 key areas of difficulty. So when you've got a website that sets third-party cookies, because they're making a decision to set the third-party cookie, they are responsible for providing the the cookie information, and also for collecting the consent. But the third party setting the cookie is also responsible for both of those things. So you're in a strange situation where the website has got a direct relationship with the user, so they can easily provide that information, collect that consent, whereas the third party setting the cookie, the third party's cookie provider, they've got all of the information about what that cookie does, who information will be shared with, and the ideal solution is going to be for both of those parties to collaborate to deliver that information to the data subject. But very rarely is this going to be possible. This is mainly because of the size and the nature of these third parties setting the cookie. So large social media platforms, large advertising firms. It's going to be really difficult for individual websites using third-party cookies to collaborate with these large parties each time. So that's a key hurdle to ensuring that data subjects receive the level of information that they need. Tying into this point is the second item on the slide, and this is the complexity of the data flows involved. So website providers need to understand what these third-party cookies are doing if they're going to explain it to the data subjects. But most of the time, people using third-party cookies just don't have an understanding of the data flows involved and what's happening with this data, which means they can't then explain that to individuals visiting their websites. On to the next point then. So the ICO have stated that, sorry, previous slide, Charlotte, but next point on the slide. So the ICO have stated that they want people to avoid these ambiguous references to partners and third parties. What they want instead is people to be specific, so name third parties that you're working with, because that way the consent that you collect is going to be informed. And then finally on this slide, not all consent mechanisms are currently compliant in that when you go to a page, you need to be able to accept or reject all cookies when you land on that page. It's not enough that you're then asked to go to a third party page to reject that third party cookie. It needs to all happen when you land on that first website. And that's where a number of websites are falling down at the moment, is that they don't have that functionality on the site for those third party cookies to be rejected. So to finish off then on the final slide, I want to look at how I see things developing in the next couple of years. Because of compliance concerns and also because users are demanding much greater control over their data, Google has announced the phasing out of support for third-party cookies in Google Chrome by 2023. This was originally supposed to happen in 2022, but it's been pushed back by a year. But worth noting that Mozilla Firefox and Safari have both already done this. So if your business is reliant on data collected from third-party cookies, now definitely is the time to revisit your digital marketing strategy and move away from this reliance on third-party cookies. Just because third-party cookies are being phased out, this doesn't mean that you won't be able to provide and deliver targeted advertising. It's just going to be about looking at alternative solutions and different ways of delivering this targeted advertising. And one way of doing this is going to be using and utilizing Google's Privacy Sandbox, which is launching. The launch of this coincides with the phasing out of these third-party cookies. And it is effectively web tools to enable businesses to deliver that targeted advertising whilst also respecting individual privacy rights. And I think it acknowledges the need for other solutions if they are going to phase out those third-party cookies. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like once it's been launched. I will now hand over to Charlotte to talk a bit more about real-time bidding.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm Charlotte Kingman. I'm an associate in the data protection team, and I'm going to be going into real-time bidding in a bit more detail. So as Tom already mentioned, real-time bidding is a tool which enables you to sell advertising space on your website to the highest bidder. And it allows advertisers to target specific users or specific groups of individuals based on their browsing history and the other data that's been collected about that individual, which Hannah and Tom have already talked about. So it's something that you've probably all experienced even without realizing it, as Tom mentioned. If you've been looking at something online and then visited another website which is entirely separate, only to find that the products that you've been looking at appear on the search bar or on the side of the new website that you're looking in. The technology around this is really sophisticated, and it will basically target you based on the information collected through your browsing activity as a whole, as Hannah talked about. So this can include things like your age or age range, location, your interests, your gender, and again, as Tom mentioned, even things in a much more detail, possibly your religion or health implications. It works similar to an auction, but with the buying and selling of impressions. And this is what they refer to as the currency used in real-time bidding. An impression is essentially where an ad is displayed on the user's screen, so i.e. they're creating an impression on you as that user. The process is complex and it takes place within a matter of seconds, basically within the time that it takes you to load the website. So the publishers, being the owners of the website pages or the apps where the ads are being displayed, typically charge for those impressions, and the advertisers place their bids based on the value of each impression. Many different service providers are involved in this process and sit behind the advertisers buying the online advertising space. This includes things like supply side platforms, demand side platforms, ad exchanges, and many more. It is an area that has attracted a lot of attention, specifically over the last few years, with the ICO starting their investigation into real-time bidding and AdTech in 2009. As Tom mentioned, this was paused due to the pandemic, but they have now announced in January this year that they have resumed their investigation. So we are hoping for more specific and tailored guidance from the ICO in this area in due course, hopefully later this year. It's really important to stress what Tom mentioned, that the ICO has addressed this as an area that should be looked at by organisations as a matter of urgency. And they have stated that sharing people's data with potentially hundreds of companies without properly assessing and addressing the risk of this raises questions around security and retention of data, which is obviously key principles that underpin the data protection regime in the UK and Europe. So how does the process work? Well, when you visit a website, your browser will send a request to the website server to retrieve the content that needs to be displayed. If the content includes advertising space, the response back to the browser will contain a code that tells the browser to request information from the publisher's ad server. To purchase advertising space through real-time bidding, you have to use a demand-side platform, which is an advertiser's buying platform that facilitates the purchase of an ad campaign and also allows the monitoring of the performance of that ad campaign. The data is then broadcast to multiple advertisers and essentially put out to auction. This would include details about the advertising space, the URL, the IP address, and then information about you as that user, as we talked about, your browsing history, etc. Once the information's been shared, the ad tech companies are able to collate the information that's been shared, but also use other information that they know about you and your user behavior in order to decide whether or not they want to bid on that advertising space. And advertisers then have the ability to bid on specific audiences. In auction fashion, the highest bidder wins, and the ad will be displayed on the website to the user. So in terms of the personal data implications around real-time bidding, Hannah's already touched upon that it uses third-party cookies, of course, from your browsing history to be able to collate a picture about you as a user and what you're interested in. From a compliance perspective, you also need to be mindful of the trading and advertising regulations, which we aren't going to go into today, but predominantly we are focusing on the use of the personal data that is captured by these third-party cookies, which enables this real-time bidding and the tailoring of advertising to you as the user. As Hannah's already discussed, these types of non-essential cookies require the user's consent, and they must meet the that must meet the requirements of PECA. But it's also really important to remember that you do need to have a lawful basis for collecting this personal information, and that shouldn't be confused with collecting consent under PECA. They are different. Real-time bidding is sophisticated and it is very technical, and all of the information that you do collect, as Tom mentioned, can involve things like special category data. So whether that's information about somebody's health or religion or even political views, if the information collected can draw an inference about somebody's behaviours. We'd normally expect organisations to rely on legitimate interests as their lawful basis under data protection law. But the ICO has expressed concerns about this, particularly using legitimate interests as a controller for a controller of the information and running that website. They've basically stated that the legal basis for processing an initial website bid the controller is unable to show in that circumstance that the use of the personal data would be proportionate, that it would have a minimal privacy impact, and that this data subject would not necessarily object if they were properly informed and really understood about how their data was being used. The ICO have expressed concerns that organisations don't always have a valid lawful basis, therefore, and that the processing of this data as part of real-time bidding can therefore potentially be non-compliant. They've also expressed concerns that real-time bidding may allow companies to collect information about special category data, as we've already talked about, and this does attach a high degree of care. And from a legal perspective, you would be required to meet the conditions of Article 9, which in this context, in practice, would require you to take consent for the collection and the processing of that special category data, which in reality would be very, very difficult to do as part of this process. And it's not something that is done in practice at the moment. There are also data sharing considerations and international transfer considerations. So it's expected that the website operators are considered as controllers of the information they collect, but there's also a number of other third parties involved in this process. And there's been suggestion by UK and EU authorities that even if the real-time bidding supply chain doesn't necessarily use and touch that personal data, that they could be considered a joint controller because of the way that they equally determine and have an input into how that data is used. This throws up some hurdles. Obviously, normally you would expect to have a data sharing agreement in place for those types of arrangements, which can be difficult in this context. Also, a number of these parties are often based outside of the UK and the EEA. So this process will be likely to involve international data transfers, which I'm sure a lot of people are aware is a particularly hot topic at the moment anyway, and has also come under scrutiny. So not only would you need to have an appropriate transfer mechanism in place, but there is an obligation now to undertake a level of due diligence across your supply chain where there's international transfers involved. And practically speaking, this could be extremely difficult when you don't know and it isn't necessarily visible which third parties are involved in that processing chain. So again, it's not meeting the requirements under the data protection regime. So we've talked a lot about the legal standpoint and obviously the developments in this area more recently, but what are the practical considerations that you need to be thinking about if you're currently using real-time bidding? Well, tread carefully and do look at this as a priority as an organisation. it is an important area, as we've mentioned, and it's really, really key now to stay up to date with the ICO updates and guidance, and really look to implement any recommendations that the ICO make as part of its investigation, and to do so quickly without delay. Like I said, we're hoping for more updates later this year, so hopefully there'll be more guidance around whether or not this is a process that can still be used, and if so, how that's going to work in practice. It's also a good time to look at your internal compliance documents in this area. So have you done a data protection impact assessment around the use of your real-time bidding? If not, we would certainly recommend that you do this without delay. This will help you assess the overall risks to the data subject that are attached to the processes that you're using. It's also good practice to undertake a data mapping exercise, again, understanding as far as you can the process that you're using and what you're using that data for, how it's collected, etc. Also, just going back to Hannah's point around the key principles of transparency and informing individuals, do look at your privacy notices, your cookie policy and your cookie consent banner. Is the drafting and the wording in those policies sufficient to give the individual proper information about what data is being collected and how that's being used? And finally, think about alternative marketing strategies and plan for what happens if you no longer can use real-time bidding or third-party cookies later this year. How is this going to impact your business and your marketing strategy overall? Is there another way that you can look to target the same customer base? It's really important to stay up to date with what's happening in the wider industry as well, not just the ICO updates. So as Hannah mentioned, Google's plans, for example, and the sandbox process that might come out later this year, because that will help frame your marketing strategy discussions around how you can use the technology to your advantage, but also within the remits of the data protection regime. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's nice to see some familiar names and some new names as well. If you do have any questions around AdTech or anything we've talked about today, please feel free to get in touch with any of us. And there's more information on our website around the services that we provide as a data protection team.